Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here to show you yet another upgrade to Corsair's iCue Link system in something additional that you can add into your system if you already have iCue Link set up. So you can see here I've got to have an HS420 vGPU with a number of iCue Link fans in it. These are the LX fans, by the way. But that's not the focus of this video. Instead, I want to talk to you about something subtle that I've added to the case, which adds some extra RGB lighting and some nice effects. And it's pretty easy to install in the system and add to it. But if you haven't noticed already, it's a couple of RGB strips, which are subtly placed along the bottom and side of this build. So you can see them here if we do a bit of a closer look at them. Now, these are really easy to install, as with anything in the iCue Link setup, so they're really easy to plug in and connect to your system and to the controller, depending on the case, because I will say that having an HS420 vGPU is a little bit tricky to build in to get the wiring just right, but more on that in a minute. And you can then add in these nice effects to it, some additional RGB lighting, which obviously then responds with the setup in iCue so that you can tweak it and customize the lighting to your own personal preference. Now, the pack, it comes with two of these long strips and this little iCue Link style controller. Now, you might think that's a standard controller, but you can see on the bottom there's an additional connector down there. And the way this works is slightly different from the controllers that you get with the standard iCue Link setup, and I'll show you that in a minute. But the idea here is to basically send the signal from that controller to the standard controller as well. And you have these lighting strips here, which have connectors on either end, which makes setting them up pretty easy, although there is one downside to it in that you're left with one bit dangling, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. And then you have some additional extension leads for connecting them up to the devices, connecting them together, connecting up to the controller, for example. So if you've got a couple of these strips, you can see one end of the cable basically connects to the other end of the other cable. And then you have another connector, which then connects to the controller. Obviously, I'm showing you this directly to the controller, but actually what you want to do is use the extension lead once you get into the case. I'll show you that in a second. And then the idea here is that you then have another short cable, which is the iCue Link cable, which goes from this controller to your standard iCue Link controller, or additionally, obviously, daisy chaining into other devices. And that's the joy of iCue Link setup, is that you can daisy chain and connect things together, with one caveat that I'll talk about in a moment. But because the iCue Link controller can take up to 24 devices now, 12 on either side, it makes it really easy to install these. Now, as you can see, I put one of the strips on the bottom, which meant that on the left-hand side, you can see here that I've got this extra bit of cable, which is now just flopping around in the case and is a bit difficult to hide away. I actually ended up using a little bit of blue tack to secure it to the bottom of the case, just so it wasn't visible and wasn't moving. On the other side, on the right-hand side, you use one of the extension cables to run that across and round the back, so we could try and hide that away as much as possible, with the idea being that I was going to put another one of these cables on the right-hand side here and then connect it up there. But I wanted to be able to hide the cables away, and the connectors aren't quite long enough that it would stretch from one to the other where I'm putting it. Obviously, this is going to depend on the case that you're putting them into and where you're putting them in your build. I decided to put this kind of near the motherboard along the storage section so I could hide some of the cabling away from it, but also still have that nice RGB effect on it. I could have put it on the right hand side maybe, but that was my choice. And then I run the connector from that cable through to the back, and then you've got this long cable that would then run to the controller. So you can see it maintains that same sort of logic with other iCue devices, in that you're daisy chaining things together, connecting one thing to the next, and then to this controller, and then from this controller to the iCue Link controller, which you can see I've already got installed. Now, the iCue Link controller in this system is actually from all-in-one cooler, the H170i RGB, and that allows you to then plug in multiple devices. But what you'll notice is that I've already got things plugged into it, and this is where things became a little bit more tricky, because what I thought I could do is take the pump out and fans that are on it, plug that into this adapter that I've got, and then run the cable from that to the iCue Link controller. Now, I will say it does work. It did work doing this, and the reason I did this is because of how many devices I had in the system. However, iCue then complained that it didn't have enough power and the brightness was being reduced on some of the devices. I actually didn't see a reduction in brightness. It still looked pretty bright, but iCue was complaining about it and suggesting there was an issue. And I think this is the problem, because I was basically trying to connect these two things together. So you might end up needing a couple of controllers depending on what you're throwing in your system. So as I said, I was using the H170i RGB, which comes with this controller as standard. Now, historically, these only allowed for 7 devices per port on the left-hand and right-hand side of it, but you now can put 12 devices per port on there with a firmware update. So make sure you update the firmware on your controller if you haven't already. But as you know, this controller needs to be plugged into PCIe power and a USB as a minimum on your motherboard, so you need to make sure that's connected up. And if you're putting additional fans into your system, as I am with the LX fans, obviously, if you buy a dual pack of those, that comes with the controller as well. Now, because of the case and the way this is built, I end up having to use 2 controllers in the system here. And I would recommend probably thinking about doing this as well if you are going to be buying these lighting strips and put them into your system. Don't try and run other devices through that controller like I did, because it will cause issues. So you might end up having to have 2 controllers in your system, which is what I had to do. And then that obviously has other complexities to it, because you're going to need 2 PCIe power cables. If you're not too sure about this, I've done a separate detailed wiring guide on Corsair's iCue link setup that I'll link to in the description, which will maybe help. But because of the complexities of this build and the way the case works, I ended up having to run additional cables. Now, the other thing I want to let you down with is I haven't shown the RGB lighting effects from these strips, and that's because I had to swap it out and put in a 5090, and that's why you've seen that, because we've gone from a 4090 to a 5090 with a side-mounted AIO and additional fans, and so it just ended up being a lot more complicated. And then I couldn't get the footage to show what the RGB lighting effects were specifically on those strips. But obviously it's additional RGB, so it follows the same sort of logic as the other fans in the system and the other devices you've got in there. So you can just use iCue in this case to apply murals or the watercolor effects to it. You can get some really nice RGB lighting out of it. It's just additional strips. And as you can see, it's diffused lighting, and it really adds into the system and makes it look nice, and it's pretty easy to install, and you can use it in a big case like this. This is obviously quite a large case, which can take up to a 420mm all-in-one cooler on the top, for example, so you can see how wide and tall it is. This has been the Perfect Prawn. Check out the links in the description to find out more, and thanks for watching.